Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Mary Saunders, and I'm a PhD student in the agronomy department at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I'm here speaking about a part of my PhD research on how the unique cultural and ecological role of tartary buckwheat facilitates genetic resource conservation in Yunnan, China. So most of you are probably pretty familiar with this concept of crop centers of origin. The agricultural crops in which we all depend for food were first domesticated by farmers from wild plant populations in different areas around the world. Now these centers typically have very high genetic diversity and are important reservoirs of genetic material for plant breeding. So what typically happens is that collectors will go to these areas, collect propagated material and deposit it in a centralized breeding institution or a seed bank, where it's available for professional breeders to make selections and crosses. And through this process, genetic diversity is preserved ex situ, and it's an important part of modern agriculture as we know it. What I'm interested in talking about is what's known as the in-situ or on-farm component of crop genetic resources. There's been a growing recognition that in the process of extracting a seed from its original context, that valuable information is lost. The farmers who grow these plants are intimately acquainted with agronomic characteristics of the varieties and different traits that affect processing methods, the use, the flavor, and other qualities that are important to breeders and farmers and end consumers. So although they're not professional plant breeders, farmers who save their own seed typically engage in a type of selection every season. Many farmers set aside the best heads of grain for their seed for the next year. And even in cases where farmers are not actively selecting seed, the crops that perform the best on their farms, and for a grain crop in particular, they produce the most viable seed and are more strongly represented in the following year's crop population. So through this in-situ process, there's a continued evolution of the crop population on the land, and it makes the ex-situ system a living, evolving, and decentralized complement to the ex-situ system. The crop that I'm working with is called tartary buckwheat. It's Fagopyrum tataricum in family Polygonaceae, and it's one of two cultivated Fagopyrum species. It's the self-pollinated species. Common buckwheat, as you probably know, is cross-pollinated. It's what you might typically think of as a mountain crop. It has an early maturity period. It's very nutritious. It has complementary nutrients in it. It contains lysine, which is an essential amino acid not found in cereal grains. It has pretty low fertility requirements, but on the other hand, it's low yielding and has kind of a bitter taste. Its name in Chinese is bitter buckwheat, and that contrasts with the Chinese name for common buckwheat, which is sweet buckwheat. The wild ancestor of tartary buckwheat is distributed across the Himalayas here, and it is believed to be first domesticated in southwest China. In Yunnan province, where I've been working, it's planted by many of the diverse ethnic groups that are located there. There's about 25 of the recognized minority nationalities in Yunnan province. There are 25 recognized minority nationalities in Yunnan province, and that's out of 56 recognized minority nationalities in the entire People's Republic of China. But this crop is often associated with one particular ethnic group known as the Yi. This image I took from a paper by a Japanese scientist called Omi Onishi. He identified the wild ancestor of both common and tartary buckwheat in southern China, and it's showing here the different dispersal routes of tartary buckwheat across Asia after domestication. But he points out, and I would also like to bring your attention to this area here, which is showing the migration routes of Yi people down out of Sichuan into Yunnan province and across Yunnan province. And Onishi, as well as a lot of other scholars, accredit the ancestors of the Yi people with first domesticating the buckwheat crop and being important in the early dispersal. So basically, I'm just kind of setting you up for this idea that Yunnan is an important source of buckwheat landrace diversity and a unique environment for continued crop evolution, with many different agroecosystems, many different ethnic groups, and a highly heterogeneous environment. one of the basic questions in my research is what environmental, social, and economic factors influence the landscape scale structure of on-farm tartary buckwheat genetic diversity? And that's a pretty basic question. A more pointed question is, do we people manage more tartary buckwheat genetic resources than other ethnic groups in this area? And this secondary question really grew out of coming to Yunnan for several years and just running into all these people, and you want to find buckwheat, go to the Yi people, and there's a very strong link between these two things in Yunnan. So in order to look more deeply at these questions, we designed the following study. We identified 7 areas where tartary buckwheat is grown, typically by lots of different groups in Yunnan province. And within each of these 7 areas, we went to 6 villages. 3 were Yi and 3 non-Yi. Within each village, we conducted interviews and collected seed at 6 households. And we asked farmers to give us seed lots of each of their named varieties of seed. So in total, we went to 45 villages for 230 households and 295 seed populations. And this spanned 14 different ethnic groups in Yunnan province. We have survey data, and then the collected seed, we extracted DNA and are doing an AFLP analysis, but I'm only going to be presenting an aspect of the survey data today. So some of my major findings from the survey is what I like to call the tartary buckwheat zone in Yunnan province, and the fact that Yi people are associated with a certain type of a mountain environment, and this is also an environment where tartary buckwheat performs very well. I'm calling it the overlap of an agroecological niche between a crop and people. So probably the easiest way to measure this is looking at elevation. On this graph, the darker blue colors represent larger field size for tartary buckwheat. At lower elevations, people have a lot of different cropping options, and you see much more diverse farms and smaller acreages devoted to tartary buckwheat. At higher elevations, there's fewer things that you can grow, but tartary buckwheat becomes a larger proportion of people's farms, and the field sizes become larger. You also see Yi people at much higher concentrations higher up in the mountains, and there's many cultural and historical reasons why, and people give you lots of different explanations for this, but it's kind of a truism in Yunnan that Yi people live in the mountains, and that's certainly what we found in our survey. Another way to look at this is when we went to each family or each household that we interviewed and asked what crops people are growing and what acreage they are devoting to each crop. And so we took the areas of each crop and looked at that as an abundance, a species abundance within a community. And this is an ordination of these different cropping communities, NMDS, and the Yi households are represented by red dots, and the non-Yi households are represented by black dots. So there's not a whole lot of separation, as you can see in this ordination, but there is a bit of a clustering here at the end, at this side with tartary buckwheat, oats, rutabaga, and medicinal crops. And if you look at some of the names of these other crops, rutabagas and oats on one side, and then fava beans and rice and soybeans on the other side, and there's also an inherent altitudinal gradient. Now, a lot of people have called buckwheat the national crop of the Yi, and I've gone to some villages and spoken to some of the elders or people who are more knowledgeable about cultural history, and they'll tell you a story about the excuse me, the origins of the Yi people are intimately connected with this crop, and it's something that has been given to them by the gods, or we use it in important cultural rituals. So this is something that tartary buckwheat is found in Yi songs and old stories. But not everybody in all the villages knows these stories. So in our surveys, we asked more simple questions, like how many ways do you eat and prepare buckwheat? And here are some of the ways that it was presented to me, because you're probably all familiar with the phenomenon. If you ask about it, something, people assume that you love it and want to eat only that thing. But we did find a pattern with more Yi people having more different ways of preparing and eating buckwheat. Of course, some people, including some Yi people, ate no buckwheat at all and said it's so bitter, we only feed it to our animals. But we definitely saw a pattern related to ethnicity here. And likewise, cultural uses. Some groups don't use buckwheat culturally at all, but some other groups maybe eat it at New Year's as a sort of celebration food, and that is something that you see in a lot of different communities. But as you get to the groups that have more cultural uses, they'll use buckwheat for exorcisms and for harvest festivals, as well as weddings and funerals. Then you see there's a lot more people who are using the crop this way. The last point I want to make is this sort of complicated relationship of markets. And anybody and many of us are working in developing countries and see the kind of crazy influence of economic markets, both for maybe good and for evil. And here's a buckwheat selling market in Jiaotong Prefecture. But in the case of buckwheat, the opening of the economic markets in this part of China has really decreased people's willingness to plant it. And this cuts across all ethnic groups. The vast majority of people are growing less buckwheat than they did 5 years ago. And you can see from this graph, one of the major reasons why. There are a lot of reasons people give for growing less buckwheat, but mostly people say you can't make any money on it. I'd rather grow potato or maize or rapeseed or pole bean, and in fact, many of these crops are crops that people named as replacing buckwheat in their farms. However, if there is a market for buckwheat that people want to enter into, it tends to increase the amount of land that they're willing to put into buckwheat. And we had about 20% of our respondents who reported selling buckwheat, and their areas that they planted to buckwheat were significantly higher than people who reported no selling of the buckwheat crop. We did a few, we were playing with some models with this and found that the area of land people planted to buckwheat was increased with selling, as well as the accessibility of the village. If it's more accessible in terms of roads and transportation, people are more likely to sell it. But if people have more cultural uses for buckwheat, they're less likely to sell it. And I have many people say, oh, I only have enough for my own use, or barely have enough for my own use, I don't have enough to sell. And I think because of these contrasting forces that there was no significant relationship with the ethnicity. So in conclusion, I found an environmental overlap of Tartary buckwheat and Yi villages. Also that Tartary buckwheat is in a lot of very diverse rotations around Yunnan province, and perhaps that's a reason that it is stable here, at least in small amounts. It's useful to a lot of different people growing many different crops. Yi households do persist in traditional practices that promote the conservation of genetic resources, and farmers with a commercial buckwheat market can plant more. I do think that if there was targeted market development for Tartary buckwheat, this could be a potentially important conservation tool, as most of our farmers make a lot of decisions based on the economic value of what they can grow. And so I'm working on the AFLP data, but hopefully when that comes out, we'll be able to more formally test relationships between the planted area, named varieties that people are growing, and genetic diversity, as well as testing models of population structure and gene flow in Yunnan province. So I have a lot of wonderful people who've helped me out a lot. I'd like to acknowledge my funding sources, and then thank my advisor, Josh Poser, who passed away in April, and members of my committee, Eve, who is here, and my wonderful Chinese collaborators, Peng Doi, Wu Jiangfeng, Li Junfang, Wang Xinhui, Oh Zhongguan, my fellow IGER trainees in Wisconsin, my family, and of course the gracious buckwheat farmers of Yunnan. Time for one question.
Can you tell, do we know what causes the bitter component? What is the bitter component?
I think it's quercetin is one thing that people say. There's a few different antioxidants, flavonoids, but quercetin is a major one.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot.